Audio Jungle.
Is this what it's going to take? An invasion by an ancient army to get some common sense into these treasonous ratbags behind me who are off selling our country out left, right and centre. Global warming. What a load of waffle. It's a natural progression. Back to the Ice Age, we're heading very slowly, well past our time. Now I'm going to reintroduce you to Outsiders. Sky News Outsiders. Fantastic program, and it's well worth watching. You will learn something about...
Malcolm, I'd like you to talk us through the history. How did we arrive at this point where the Australian government has 30 bureaucrats wandering around, slipping over the ice in Katowice in Poland, going from one meeting room to another, sub-zero temperatures? How do we end up at this point? What's the history, and how can a Liberal government be involved in this madness?
Well, the first thing to remember about the Paris Agreement that was signed in 2015 under Turnbull's watch is that Paris is the agreement that is not agreement. It's the agreement you have when you don't want to make an agreement. So let's explain what happened in the previous meeting in Copenhagen, where we had people flying in from all over the world doing the deal, and then at the last minute the leaders were supposed to come in and sign the deal, have all the smiles, and away they go. It all fell apart, as we know. So what happened in Paris was that the leaders all came for the start, and they did all their smiling and their handshaking, their declarations and the catastrophe that would befall us and how we're going to unite and all the rest of this rubbish. And then they started negotiating in all the back rooms. And they didn't get an agreement. Each country wanted to do its own thing. And so what happened was we had an agreement that each country would go home and do something to get into the agreement. And now what we're seeing is that China and many other countries are saying, to hell with this, we don't want to destroy our country, but we've got you stupid idiots in the West convinced, and so we will destroy your industry, and that's what's happening to us, and we will march merrily along. But we also don't want to have sanctions. So what's going on in Poland now is that these people are trying to do deals to get out altogether of even the monitoring system that the UN wants to put in place. In other words, Rowan, what you can see is gutlessness from politicians. We know this is nonsense, but no one is game to stand up and say so.
And where did it all begin? Take us back to the beginning. How did Australia ever get involved in this rubbish?
Well, it comes back again to gutlessness and weakness. Barnaby Joyce in 2000 and up until about 2011 was the best speaker in Australia on the sceptic side of politics with regard to this. Without a doubt, he was colourful, he was accurate. Now, I drove 6 hours out to his electorate office in St George when he was a senator at the time, and I met with him in February 2011. We sat there having a cup of tea, about a metre apart in his office, and he looked at me and he said, "Mate, this is all based on corruption. There is no data underpinning this, and it's all a furphy." And Barnaby Joyce was exactly correct. He then told me that 65% at least or more of the Liberals were sceptics, and he said, if not all, then all the National Party members were sceptics. Now, Barnaby remained a sceptic, and then suddenly in the 2016 election, Malcolm Turnbull showered $400 million, almost $500 million, on his electorate in the form of wind farms. And Barnaby Joyce, when he was asked about that, said, "Well, mate, if it does no damage and it gives the farmers a bob, good luck to them." Well, the problem with that is that Barnaby Joyce's little favour, $400 million, has to be paid for by us and the electricity users, which is driving this country bankrupt, and especially in manufacturing. So Barnaby Joyce became an alarmist because he became a member of the cabinet. And when you enter cabinet, your lips are sealed. That's what happens. There are many sceptics in the Liberal Party. Craig Kelly is the best of them now. Now what we see in Barnaby Joyce is because he's on the outer again, he's now starting to speak up a little bit about climate and the sceptic side of climate, and he's questioning it. Yes. What I'm trying to explain from this is that this started back in 1976 with the Great Pacific Climate Shift. Up until that time, Stephen Schneider and others were forecasting imminent catastrophic global freezing due to hydrocarbon fuels, coal and oil. Notice that, the same culprits but opposite result. In 1976, there was a slight jump in temperatures, the Great Pacific Climate Shift. And then there was a slight increase in temperatures, nothing unusual. And then since 1995, we've had temperatures basically flat.
Right.
There's been nothing going on.
So,
but this is the ad that they ran in the lead up to the Copenhagen fiasco. Have a look.
What I've tried to explain is that it started off a furphy. You've highlighted that brilliantly with that clip of ridiculous fear. It's driven by emotion, but it's also driven, as I keep coming back to, gutlessness and weakness on the part of major politicians in this country. I want to talk now about property rights and John Howard. Now, in 2007, I bought half a Jaguar car for my father. He paid the other half because my dad had always wanted a Jaguar. So we were driving back from Sydney with the Jag, and it was Good Friday in Tenterfield, and we needed breakfast. So we stopped at the local cafe, only one open at the time, and there was a Historical Society museum there. And I saw the pictures of every Prime Minister in Australia's history, little black and white pictures. Here we were in Tenterfield, and I saw John Howard as the last one. And I realised, looking over Keating and Hawke and Fraser, that Howard had been atop the political game for 30 years. So later that year, Rowan, when he got the boot, I wrote him a letter saying, thank you very much for your contribution over the last 30 years. Got a nice, polite thank you back. Now, I mention that to show that I was basically a supporter of Howard in some ways. In 2014, I wrote him another letter after I'd spent years researching this climate, and I told him that I rescinded my letter from 2007. That man did these things. In 1996, he was a Liberal Prime Minister. He did a deal with the Borbidge National Party government to steal property rights in the guise of protecting native vegetation. Now, John Howard said all along, so this is how a man behaves, he said all along that he would not sign the Kyoto Protocol. And all of us clapped, but he said we would comply. Now, he had a problem. How do you comply? There was no appetite for destroying industry. So what we then needed to do was to stop the clearing of land that were the sinks for the vegetation that was the sinks for carbon dioxide absorption. So what he did was he started to work on protecting vegetation, stopping the clearing of land. Now, he had a problem. Under Section 51, Clause 31 of the Australian Constitution, any interference with private property rights must receive just terms compensation. This was going to cost John Howard hundreds of billions of dollars. So what he did, his government deceitfully went round the back door and did deals with Borbidge first of all, and then in 1998 he ramped it up with a deal with Beattie. In 2004 it was really ramped up to get Queenslanders to stop clearing land, to absorb carbon dioxide, maintain the absorption of carbon dioxide. He did the same in a grubby deal with Bob Carr, and Bob Carr is actually on YouTube gloating about stealing farmers' property rights.
Let's have a listen. Let's have a listen.
I introduced laws that protected on private land, private farmland, wetlands, restricted what farmers could do in filling them in. We protected native vegetation and gave John Howard the right to boast about how Australia is achieving its greenhouse targets. There are restrictions on private property rights.
And stopped farmers from clearing their land or chopping down mulga. So we've heard about these problems, farmers getting very upset they can't use their own land, and you're saying this is confiscating their property rights because they bought the property but now they can't do anything with it.
There are comments from Peter Beattie in a ministerial statement confirming that. Bob Carr confirmed that. That's just the first thing that John Howard did. He stole private property rights. We now see the catastrophe that's looming in agriculture right across this country because of that. The second thing John Howard did was that he introduced a renewable energy target. Now, just 12 months ago, the same man, John Howard, said that the renewable energy target is destroying the country and it's way too high. Now, the third thing he did was he became the first leader of a major party to introduce an emissions trading scheme, which is a carbon tax. He was going to do it in 2012, which is roughly when Julia Gillard did it, telling a lie. So what you can see here is weakness, gutlessness, a treasonous approach to Australia. Now, get this, Rowan. In 2013, you quite correctly mentioned that John Howard addressed the Global Warming Policy Foundation, a sceptic think tank, and he said, after destroying Australian manufacturing, after destroying the farming industry, after putting in place a carbon taxes policy, he said he was agnostic on climate science. In other words, he didn't know which way it went. And the reason for that, Rowan, is there is no science.
You had a look at the outsiders and the information on climate change. Make your own decision, research it, because you're paying for it. We allow these idiots to close down our power stations for renewable energy. I mean, what a crock. Everybody knows batteries run down. Anyway, Dr. Barry here in Canberra, the House of Treason, returning to Melbourne, and thank you for watching.